Hello and welcome to episode 221 of Stand Up. Joining me today from Fordham University, political scientist, author, and expert, and real good friend of mine, Dr. Christina Greer will join me, and former Obama speechwriter, bestselling author, David Litt joins me as well. My name is Pete Dominick. It's time to stand up with me right now. Music. Yeah, this is punk rock. It's by Chad Schlosser, who is a listener and subscriber. Sent me the music. I was using royalty-free bullshit before this. He gave it to me. So I want to give him the plugs. His band is Maggie Pullett. And this is Headboard. All right, everybody. Hey. Happy, I don't know what day it is. It's Friday. TGIF. Unfortunately, Christian Finnegan, I screwed up. I couldn't get him get it together. I had a crazy day on yesterday. Our schedules didn't work out. I really missed talking to Christian. He joins me almost every Friday, and so I'm sorry that I was not able to get him on. But I did get the opportunity to talk to Dr. Christina Greer and David Litt, both of who are on today's podcast, and awesome conversations with both of them coming up. But now it's time to talk a little bit about the news, which I do every day because this is a daily podcast, and so I always try to do a news segment at the top. Many of you do listen every day and even in the morning, so I give you my take and a take on what are some of the most important news stories, media stories, and obviously stories related to democracy and COVID, as we are right now just 5 days away. Is it 5 days? 4 days? I don't know how many days. So, how are you feeling? Don't you just want to go to sleep until it's all over? Are you feeling confident? What are you watching? What are you paying attention to? Will you be joining us tonight? Tonight, it's a costume party, a virtual costume party. Yeah, I don't like real costume parties, but I don't mind a virtual one because I only have to wear a costume basically on the face, on the upper body. And I highly recommend maybe, changing your background to something funny or scary or whatever, something interesting. If you want to join us tonight, you got to be a subscriber to the stand-up community. And with that, you get to join the Zooms as well as access to our Discord platform, which makes sure that you're never alone because there's always people in there talking on text, on voice, and even on video on our Discord platform created by listeners for listeners of this show. People who are curious, kind, passionate, thoughtful, often very funny, and good folks who want to learn things every day from the folks that we talk to, including each other. So check that out. Hope to see you tonight. Hope you'll wear a costume. And I'm going to try... I shouldn't say this unless I can make it happen, but I want to get a few of my regular favorite guests to pop in with a mask of some sort on, and we have to guess who they are. Wouldn't that be fun? I'm going to try to make that happen. I don't know if I can get anybody to do that, if I'll have time, if they'll even want to do it. I think that would be funny and fun. So that may not happen, may not. Either way, we'll get some folks to join us Friday night, and I hope that you will be there, 8 Eastern. Check it out, patreon.com/Pete Dominick, or go to the paid subscription link in the show notes. All right, let's get to the news, shall we? Here is Matt Kaiser's WTF Just Happened Today newsletter on day 1379 of our long national nightmare, which might almost be over. Kind of, maybe. Today, in one sentence, he writes, the U.S. economy is about 3.5% smaller than it was during the pandemic. The Supreme Court allowed extended deadlines for receiving ballots in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. That's good. States lack federal funding needed to prepare sites to receive and distribute a coronavirus vaccine whenever the FDA authorizes one. That's bad. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his wife and his son repeatedly emailed State Department officials about personal matters. Apparently, that's also bad. But you know what's good? That daily newsletter, WTF Just Happened Today, which Matt puts together every day. I love that. Okay, so in other stories and digging deeper and more specific, it seems that the national press has descended onto the Lone Star State, Texas, which is leading the country in early voting with more than 8.5 million people, and they've already cast their ballots. That's 95% of the total number of people people who voted in Texas in 2016. Wow. Democrats have been talking about Texas, turning Texas blue for a long time. And New York Times says they point to the political shifts brought by the state's fast-growing and diversifying population, and Donald Trump has supercharged those changes, plunging the traditionally conservative suburbs into open revolt against what many college-educated voters, particularly women, see as a divisive president. Are you watching Texas, folks? Listeners in Texas, what do you think? I've been hearing from my friend Addison and, of course, Tina Winsett. Who else is in Texas? Isaac is a listener in Texas. Cornell. Those are just four off the top of my head. I'd love to hear from you and anybody else living in Texas about what you think about the prospects. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. By the way, Dan Leaf is a regular listener and subscriber and contributor in our Zoom chats. He's a phys ed teacher in California. And he wrote me an email this morning who said, top 10 review for this morning's intro. Yesterday's podcast intro. He loved it so much. He stopped listening to it to write the email, standupwithpete@gmail.com. And he said, this morning's intro was fucking awesome, Pete. And now I think of it, the last few intros have all been very informational and very entertaining. Your quality is still ascending. The news and the clips are great. You're on the right track. I loved listening to it. So much that I stopped listening to write this email. I'm going to shut the fuck up now and go back to listening to your show. I look forward to more. Please continue what you're doing. I love supporting you, doing a great job. Dan, thank you for that email. Thank you for your kind emails, everybody. I read them all, and I email back a lot of you. I've been calling a lot of you, and if I haven't, I'd love to get on the phone with you. Let's find some time. Okay, on Thursday, I moderated a virtual town hall for Pam Keith. I want to mention her every day between now and Election Day. If you can send her any money, PamKeithFL.com. She is such an impressive candidate. And I moderated a town hall with her. Congressman Hank Johnson of Georgia was there. And we also had two other awesome panelists. That's on Pam's Facebook page. And we were focused on the environmental issues, the Everglades, Lake Okeechobee, in south central Florida, just south of Orlando is where her district is. She is so great. I I'll play some clips from it next week, but I definitely highly recommend you go. If you haven't listened to my interviews with Pam, you'll love them. And you should check out her Facebook page, like her Facebook page, and see if there's anything you can do to help either send money or volunteer for her campaign. So that was a really fun, awesome thing to be involved with. Felt really good about that on Thursday. And speaking of listener mail, I want to just reference two other emails I got yesterday after my conversation with Bill B. in D.C. And we had an argument, or a thoughtful discussion, I think is probably a better way to say it, yesterday's episode about how divisive, how violent things will get. And I'm playing the more positive, optimistic side than many of you are. And so I think we hope I'm right, but I may very well be wrong about it, and including a couple of listeners that thought I was. Mike H. emailed me at standupwithpete@gmail.com and wrote, sorry, bud, you're so wrong about the risk of violence. We are the same age. This is the first time I remember militias being arrested by the FBI for plotting the arrest and execution of a sitting governor. Your question of what they will lose, it's the wrong question. It's what do they perceive they will lose. These people are not logical. They have convinced nonviolent people, my family included, into believing the enemy is coming for them. They believe local police are not prepared to save the Constitution, whatever the fuck that means. We're allowing our streets like Lansing, Michigan to look like a fucking war zone with overweight white guys marching around in camo gear. But I hope you're right. That's from Mike H. Mike, you make good points. I always appreciate your emails. Super smart, thoughtful guy. Keep it coming. Thanks for listening. Sasha emailed me from New Mexico, where he says he's a subscriber, longtime listener, and says, I want to address the point you're talking with the great Bill B. in D.C. about. He didn't say the great. I just added that. He writes, personally, I've seen a rise in violence associated with the far right, sentiments that Trump is fanning, and I'm worried about what further violence may be coming, both if they win and if they lose the election. If they win, I'm worried that they'll feel further empowered and encouraged to perpetrate acts of violence against people on the left, Democrats. If they lose, I'm afraid they could lash out in anger. My best friends, who I've grown up with all my life, are Muslim. I'm from Abiqui, is that how it's pronounced? The town in New Mexico, which has the Dar al-Islam Mosque. They currently live in San Francisco, and they've put out, or rather Santa Fe, and they've put out Black Lives Matter signs in their front yards on the fence. In the last several weeks, they've seen increasing acts of violence along the whole street against anyone who has Black Lives Matter signs on their yards. My friend Samia had her windshield broken on her car out in the driveway. The car was again egged a few days later, as well as several other houses with signs having their cars egged. The picture I included below was a log thrown through the back windshield of my friend Fatima's car during the night, and just yesterday they woke up to their signs being defaced with Blue Lives Matter and racist and bigot. I think that throwing a log through someone's windshield is an act of violence, and I'm very concerned about what's potentially coming. Sasha, thank you for your email and your perspective. It matters. I definitely am seeing this through my lens, through my communities, where I think my town, it's definitely mostly Trump supporters. Matter of fact, they're going to have a rally in my town this weekend, and I think I'm going to go and try to talk to them and record it. What do you think? Hopefully I live. But all I'm saying, let me just try to say it again, which is, yes, things have gotten worse and more violent, and they will get worse and probably more violent. What I'm trying to say is I'm pushing back on the rhetoric like blood in the streets and civil war and race war. Yes, certain people are going to be are way more vulnerable. It's a lot easier for me and my white male vessel that I travel in with just an unbelievable amount of symmetry in my face, perfectly shaped skull, and maybe 8% body fat. Sure, easy for me. But a lot of people are members of more vulnerable populations that are discriminated against and that have violence perpetrated against them just because of what they look like every day. So I'm never not thinking about them when I'm giving my opinion. Well, maybe I am. Maybe I'm not being sensitive enough, frankly. So anyway, it's a conversation, I think, about how bad it gets, how frequent, how impactful the violence becomes, and what we can do about it. And we'll keep having that conversation because, unfortunately, it's not going away. I wanted to address a couple things that happened in the media. Of course, big story Thursday when the Intercept's Glenn Greenwald resigned, quit, because they would not, his editors at the Intercept, which he co-founded, would not print his story. And that blew up. And Glenn wrote a big, long diatribe about why he quit. And the editors at the Intercept wrote a response blasting him. And it's pretty ugly and pretty sad. And they refer to him as a once great journalist. I'm sure it's not the last we will hear of Glenn Greenwald. All right, moving on to other more mainstream journalists. How about CNN's Jim Acosta posted a video of maskless Trump fans in Arizona chanting CNN sucks, hundreds of them, as he stood there and adjusted his mask. Here's the audio of that. The music in the background. CNN sucks. Bunch of maskless people. That's got to feel good if you're Jim Acosta or anybody else. I can't believe I used to do that job. I mean, not quite Jim Acosta's job, but I used to run around the country with a CNN microphone and camera crew. And, man, it's a lot worse now. I mean, people would say things, they'd call it the Clinton News Network, but it was like playful. And then they would actually do on-camera interviews with me and be cool. But Chicken News Network, it was called. But that was harmless compared to now. I feel bad for and worry about a lot of my friends working at CNN. All right. What else do we have for you in media from Thursday? Yes. MSNBC's Chuck Todd getting criticized for saying both sidesing the COVID issue when it comes to Trump and Biden. Trump not taking it seriously enough, but maybe Biden is taking it too seriously. Really? That you had both sides taking COVID seriously while you're a 77-year-old man running around the country for president? Yet here it is on MSNBC with Chuck Todd.
So it's interesting when you look at both candidates in some ways, one not taking the virus seriously enough at all. And one, if there's a criticism, might be, is he taking it too seriously, at least when it comes to campaigning? Marcos, let me start with you. Is there any part of you that's nervous about the light Biden footprint when it comes?
All right. So that did not go very well on Twitter Media Matters Parker Malloy says, can we put Chuck Todd in a catapult and launch him to the sun? Matt Negrin says the mainstream news media must be dissolved, and then quote tweets the headline. MSNBC's Chuck Todd asks if Joe Biden is taking COVID too seriously. Jason Lincolns, who I love, writes, just quoting again the headline about Chuck Todd asking Joe Biden is if Joe Biden's taking COVID too seriously. Jason just writes, honestly, is this real life? Siddhartha Manhanta, what could this possibly mean? What professional journalist could possibly ask this question? My friend Jared Yates Sexton says about this, the problem is that many people covering politics for a living are so incredibly privileged that they view it as a game, and their, quote, knowledge of the workings of that game as being more important than the lives of people who suffer as a result. It's truly disgusting. Jared really not holding back on that. And finally, James Corey writes, 9/11 kills 3,000 people, and we spend the next 2 decades, thousands of lives and many billions of dollars attacking the Taliban. COVID kills 250,000 people. Some dudes are like, wearing masks and not going to bars is an overreaction. So that's all as a result of Chuck Todd asking his panel if Joe Biden might be taking COVID too seriously. Moving on for media on Thursday. What else do I have for you? Well, a Fox News report criticized Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for wearing expensive-looking outfits for a photo shoot that she did for Vanity Fair, and she reminded them that she doesn't get to keep them. They're borrowed clothes. But the Fox News report quoted a Daily Mail article that said AOC's outfits cost more than $14,000 in total, attempting to out her as a hypocrite somehow. I don't know what for, I guess, her economic policies, for being a critic of Donald Trump's policies. Anyway, she responded to that Fox News report by saying, Republicans are very mad. She wrote this on Twitter. Republicans are very mad about my appearance. This time they're mad I look good in borrowed clothes. Again, listen, if Republicans want pointers on looking your best, I'm happy to share. Tip number 1, drink water and don't be racist. Oh, she's so good on Twitter. That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman. I've had conversations with more than a couple people over the past few weeks and months that that woman is going to be the president of the United States at some point, or she's certainly going to take a serious look at it. I mean, she is very, very effective, super intelligent, and really understands how young people think and live and value what their cultural values are. So anyway, that is story number 3. And here now is a new segment I'm going to do every night, except for probably this is the only time I'll do it. It's called News Dump, where I just mention a whole bunch of headlines and you get to hear them, and maybe they overwhelm you, or maybe they make you want to look more deeper into what's behind any of these headlines, which you should be able to find pretty easily. I pick these headlines. These are the ones I'm picking. Here we go. Stand Up with Pete Dominic, News Dump. All the news stories I didn't get to, but I wanted to mention. And until somebody writes and submits an instrumental version for this, I'm going to have to use some royalty-free, really cheesy sounding news music for this. And you're going to have to deal with it because it's kind of funny. News dump! Here's a comforting headline. Walmart pulls guns and ammo from shelves as precautions against possible post-election day rioting, according to the Wall Street Journal. As virus surges, Trump rallies keep packing in the thousands. Associated Press. Second wave swells. U.S. coronavirus cases smash daily record again as 91,000 fall ill with COVID just 6 days after last peak. Every news outlet reporting that. Foreignpolicy.com. Wilbur Ross remained on Chinese joint venture board while running U.S.-China trade war. Foreignpolicy.com. CNBC, U.S. GDP booms at 33.1% rate in quarter 3, better than expected. And all news outlets referring to similar data, 1,049 COVID deaths in America on Thursday, the 29th. And that is your news dump. If you want to make my life easier and have your voice heard, email me standupwithpete@gmail.com with 3 to 5 of your favorite headlines for the Stand Up with Pete Dominic news dump. And I look forward to many of you texting, calling, and following me and telling me how much you hated the stand-up with Pete Dominic news dump. And for God's sakes, shut the hell up and just get to your guests. All right, let's do that now. Joining me first is a speechwriter who worked for President Barack Obama. He entered the White House in 2011, left in 2016 as a senior presidential speechwriter and special assistant to the president. In addition to writing remarks for President Obama on a wide range of domestic policy issues, he served as the lead joke writer for several White House Correspondents Dinner monologues. Since leaving government, he's written speeches, op-eds, and jokes for Fortune 100 CEOs, professional athletes, leading philanthropists, and prominent political figures. His New York Times best-selling memoir, Thanks, Obama, My Hopey, Changey, White House Years, was published in 2017, and his second book is so good, so helpful, so instructional and educational, and funny. It's called Democracy in One Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think. It was published in June. I highly recommend you get it. He's currently developing a sitcom for ABC. He's married. He's volunteering and trying to turn out the vote for Democrats. He is at David Litt on Twitter. And here's our conversation about long lines at the polling sites, democracy, the Constitution, analyzing the remainder of the campaign, where it's best to volunteer, working for Obama, and the future of the Supreme Court, and so many other things. David Litt. I've got him now. Very excited to be talking to David Litt just days before the election because Mr. Litt can answer so many questions I have about everything from democracy to the courts to voting. I think those are all tied in. David Litt, welcome back to Stand Up, and thank you very much for joining me.
It's good to be back.
So you have this very, I think, important and educational book, Democracy in One Book or Less. And it's so relevant for so many reasons just days before the election. You've written a recent article. I think this one was for The Guardian. You've been writing for The Atlantic and other outlets about voting right now. Specifically, this is about Ohio's very long lines, titled Ohio's Quarter-Mile Early Voting Lines. That's what voter suppression looks like. I waited for an hour and a half in the rain yesterday. Have you voted yet? And why do these long lines matter so much?
Well, no, I haven't voted yet. My wife and I are voting on Saturday. We're voting in D.C., so our votes are not, we don't get it like a senator or any sort of electoral college implications, but we're still voting, obviously. And it's interesting. It's a good example. So we both filled out our absentee ballot requests. And for some reason, I got my ballot. They were supposed to mail ballots to every voter. I got mine. Jackie did not get hers. And so we're just going to go do it in person. But it's like a useful reminder that election management is something that a lot of states in America, or districts in the case of DC, are not great at. B, most voters will find a way to get around it. So, sometimes when we hear about these problems, we shouldn't panic, but we should be vigilant about them. And C, it's possible that DC has a vendetta against my wife. So all good things to know. Let's talk about the Ohio lines for a second.
Yeah.
So what we saw in Ohio, it was not what we're seeing in places like DC or New York, which are basically just like the managers of elections are not doing a great job. They're not really prepared in the way they should be. What happened in Ohio was the state legislature put a law in place, and they said you can only have one early voting location per county, not a certain number of locations per person, per population, but one per county. And in Ohio, different counties have wildly different populations. So one county has about 13,000 people. Franklin County, which is where Columbus is now the largest county in Ohio, they have 1.3 million people. And what this is a way of trying to allocate voting resources, not by person, not so that each person gets an equal share, but so that each county gets an equal share. And it's the same way we, in the Electoral College or the Senate, say that states matter more than people. So it's just a new version of trying to make land and square miles the most important thing in our democracy rather than individual human beings. And needless to say, it's not good. We should not do that.
Is there an obvious way to fix that in terms of the polling stations?
The obvious way to fix that would be for the state legislature in Ohio to say, first of all, to allow counties to decide for themselves, right? So counties could say, we want 10 early voting locations, or we want 100. Let counties, give them the budget, let them make that decision, because every county is different. So that would be one thing. The reason the legislature is artificially constraining what counties can do is not because they're worried that counties won't help people vote. It's because they're worried counties will help people vote. So that's a really easy fix. More broadly, what our states need to do, and then what Congress should do at the federal level if we ever get the chance, is set standards that make it clear that when we say one person, one vote, we don't just mean the basics of one person, one vote, which is that every congressional district needs to have the same number of people. We also mean that everybody should have an equal opportunity to cast their ballot. It shouldn't be harder to cast your ballot if you happen to live in a city or if you happen to not be white. And right now, both of those things are true.
There are obviously certain states that try to make it as easy as possible to vote, meaning you can vote on weekends, you can do early voting, you can do mail-in voting. There are enough polling places. It's convenient. There aren't other obstacles. There are obviously entire countries where you don't see these types of issues. So it does seem like one side wants to make it a lot harder to vote than the other side. I don't think it's partisan to be pointing that out. Isn't that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I would start by saying most Americans think it should be easy to vote. I mean, I'm here when we're talking right now. I'm in North Carolina. My wife is an attorney, so she's doing poll observing outside an early voting location in North Carolina, and they're actually doing a really good job. Like, she's been pretty bored for the most part. And North Carolina is a state that has had some problems in the past, but at least in her experience at a couple of different sites, people are showing up, they're voting, there's no long line. And both Democrats and Republicans are voting early, and people want that convenience. People certainly, even if you talk to Republican voters, they don't think that that Democratic voters should not be allowed to vote. Some do, but the vast majority believe in democracy. The problem is when you get to the level of politicians. And politicians, it's like they've forgotten that they can win votes by having ideas that people like. So instead, they're like, well, we'll win elections by making sure that the people who don't like our bad ideas can't vote for us. You saw this in Texas. They just sued, Republicans just sued to try to have 100,000 valid votes in Harris County in Houston thrown out after they were already cast on some technicality. I don't think it's going to work, but the fact that we're even discussing this is bizarre, right? Like, these are people who already voted. And I do think, I want to be careful about drawing the line between sounding the alarm about a serious problem and also like making sure that we don't panic. I think we're going to see Republicans, including the president, try very hard, not just to keep people from voting, but to throw out votes that have already been cast. I think that's extremely unlikely to work. But the fact that they're going to try is pretty despicable.
How hard would it be to rig an election, meaning rigging the vote? The president has been, I keep thinking about the New York Times Magazine from a few weekends ago, where they cover the entire cover with his tweets that specifically were an effort to create doubt about mail-in voting. If I wanted to rig an election somehow with mail-in voting, what would I do? And has it ever been done successfully without people knowing?
Well, this is part of the problem. I'm trying to answer this question as like straight down the middle as I possibly can. The problem with talking about voter fraud or rigging an election or things like that is, by definition, you can't prove a negative. So if somebody says, hey, voter fraud's out there all the time, and you say, well, no, they don't find a lot of voter fraud, that person's going to turn around and say, see, the fact that they don't find it is proof that it's out there and we're not catching it. So it's not really, it's not in the realm of logic at that point. What I will say is there's just no evidence, and plenty of people have looked, that in-person voter fraud happens at any sort of scale. 1 in 35 million votes. So round down pretty far and basically get zero. And then mail-in fraud has occurred in certain cases, but it almost never is voter fraud. In other words, it's not voters sitting down and saying, I'm going to cast 2 ballots or I'm going to do something nefarious. It's candidates doing something. And it seems for the most part that they've been getting caught. Not always, but that, it's not easy to pull off. So that's one way. There's 2 ways of rigging an election, right? One is trying to manipulate the vote count and then via the voting. And the other is doing stuff that, for example, they would do in like Belarus or some country like that, where you have an election, but basically the outcome is never really in doubt. And, the leader of the country gets to sort of sit in a room, and I assume cigars are smoked, and say, how much of the vote do I want this time? That's what Belarus looks like. I want to be clear. That's not where America is yet, but we're doing more and more things that would be right at home in a country that we would not consider a democracy.
There are several states, I think, like Utah and several others that have been doing mail-in voting almost exclusively in some states for years, and there hasn't been a problem. The proposal now to make it more widespread is not only because it makes things more convenient in general, but I think people are missing this point. It doesn't get mentioned enough, David, which is there's a plague, and it's scary for a lot of people to literally go outside and to be around other people. That's not an irrational fear. Therefore, and we knew a while ago that around this time of year, it could be getting worse. We also now know it's the worst it's been. So it makes sense right now, probably a little late in terms of when you and I are talking here just a few days before, but it made certainly a lot of sense to create mail-in voting mechanisms, which is what a lot of states did. Have you seen any major problems or irregularities to the point that it could, affect the outcome of a vote based on these mail-in voting procedures that have been put in place so that people don't have to go out and get sick and die?
Well, there's definitely been no problem with mail-in voting that of the kind that the president has talked about, right? Like there's no indication that people are doing anything untoward when they fill out their mail-in ballots. We may see people try to invalidate mail-in ballots at a higher rate for all sorts of made up false reasons. And that's a real danger. And so we've got to be, vigilant and keep our eye on the ball and make sure that all the votes are counted, which they will be, right? Like we have a system for this. I should point out, if you are voting, if you haven't voted yet and you have a mail-in ballot, you can turn it in at a lot of states to a drop box. And that is a safe, that's a socially distanced way to vote. You're not stuck on a line in most states. And then the other thing is, in many cases, you can turn that mail-in ballot in at your board of elections or something else, or you can vote in person. And one of the things that I think is important to recognize here, everything you said was right. But I would add to that for most voters, unless you're in an extremely high-risk group, voting in person is safe, right? Like it's not no risk, but it's like any sort of, maybe going to the grocery store or even less risk than that. However, for poll workers, mail-in voting is very different. That's a lot more risk than most of us take on a daily basis during the pandemic, unless we have a service job, right? If you work at the grocery store, that's closer to being a poll worker. And so what is happening is half of our poll workers in America, at least before the pandemic, were 60 years old or older. So the highest risk group. So Pete, when you vote early, which you did, you're not just saving yourself the trouble of voting on election day, you're also taking away one person who would add to the line on election day for in-person voting, so that the people who are voting in person you don't need as many poll workers. So the over 60-year-olds, a lot of them aren't going to come because it's too much risk for them.
Right.
And you keep the lines short. So all of these things come together. But that's like the very long version, and the short version is, mail-in ballots make sense. It's a good alternative to voting for a lot of people. So we should do it. We should make voting easier.
The problem is that it's easy to find some mistake, some irregularity, or even somebody throwing a ballot out or something and pointing to that and say, see, but the point that always needs to be made is it's not actually pervasive enough, this what you're saying, this irregularity or even crime, to affect the outcome of the election. Yes, things happen. But the question should be, does it affect the outcome of an election in a district, in a state, much less in the country? And we can go back to Florida 2000 if we wanted to find certain examples. But I think that's just the important point to make about when we do hear these irregularities. It's so easy as if you're Sean Hannity to run with it and say, see, and obviously the president as well, say, see, they're rigging the election. But it's usually just a few ballots here and there where there was a problem. Something got lost unorganized. And maybe it was nefarious. But again, it's not enough usually to affect the outcome.
Keep in mind also, in-person voting is not perfect either, right? So I could show up to my polling place. I think this happened to Stacey Abrams. She showed up at her own polling place. Obviously, she knows a thing or two about voting. And they were like, sorry, you're not on the list. And she was like, no, double check, I'm on the list. And she was, of course, on the list. But that can happen as well, right? You can be online and there's a voting machine goes down and you're stuck online and you have to get to work, so you leave. So vote and a perfect election is never going to happen. So we should not lose faith in our democracy just because things go wrong every now and then. I wrote an article for The Atlantic about this, which is about like the risk of a stolen election. And one of the political scientists I talked to had 4 criteria for like, what does election manipulation look like? And I don't remember all 4, but that's why I wrote it down. And it was like systemic was a big one, and intentional. So let's just start with those 2, right? If something happens as a one-off, and a disproportionate impact. So if something happens as a one-off, that's a sign that we're all human. It's probably not going to swing an election. There's plenty of ways to try to correct stuff.
Right.
Also, stuff happens by accident, and that's usually okay because it happens around the margins. And then finally, some stuff happens, but it happens equally to everybody. So if, for example, you had some long lines at polling places because, we have tens of thousands of polling places, not every line can be short, but they're equally likely to be long lines in a white neighborhood and a majority black neighborhood, then you say, okay, well, this seems like the kind of thing that happens. We have to accept that it's not going to be perfect. When non-white voters are 6 times more likely to wait for an hour or more as white voters, which is what it was like in 2012, well, that's not, evenly distributed. That's very disproportionate. That's a pretty good sign that what is happening is not just sort of isolated incidents or accidents.
It's a great article at The Atlantic. I was going to ask you about it. I'm glad you brought that up. It's titled "The U.S. is Facing the Possibility of a Truly Illegitimate Election." That was posted back in August. I feel like a lot has happened since then, and I want to ask you to put on your political pundit hat, David, for one question, which I don't like to spend a lot of time on analysis, especially this close to the election. We're going to know soon enough, but I do want to ask you because this will be up before the election. Then I want to ask you about the Supreme Court, which is, I think, more important. But okay, so is it on? Is your election analysis hat fitted? Because it's just, to me, the most important detail is Hillary Clinton was the second least liked candidate ever to run. Americans are terrified of Donald Trump specifically because of the pandemic, what it has done to the economy, and they would vote for a candidate whose name was COVID. That's quick analysis on the candidate. What do you think about that alone?
So I think, first of all, my political pundit hat generally is like, go to 538.com and see what they think, right? Like that. And I'm not necessarily the best at this particular thing because I think there are probabilities and chances. The way I would describe this election and the way it's shaping up is roughly like, like you just invited me to play Russian roulette, right? Like statistically, I feel good that things will work out the way that I want them to work out. On the other hand, if the bad thing happens, it's really, really bad. And so I think that's that's why like most of the Democrats that I know, myself included, are like not going to be sleeping easy until this thing is done.
Right.
And, first of all, done, like Biden gets the most votes done. And then Trump realizes that he has no choice but to accept the results done. And then eventually Biden is sworn in, done, like done. So, that like, for example, that's why I'm trying to think about, I've spent like the last 2 weeks now basically just being a full-time volunteer. I didn't do that in 2016. And I was one of those people who was like, I probably should have done more. And we're driving up to Pennsylvania tomorrow and Saturday to go canvass there, because like that's going to be a pretty pivotal state. And so, socially distant canvassing, I should be pretty clear, like not, trying to do everything as safe as possible. But, so, all of that is to say, everything you said is true. It seems really likely that Biden will win. And it seems very likely that most people going to the booth, if they don't know who they're going to vote for, which is a small percentage of people, they're probably going to be thinking about COVID when they're in there, which is not good for Trump. But let's leave nothing to chance because Trump has a chance.
Quick question about your former boss who's out on the campaign trail for Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and I think as effective as always, using humor very effectively. You wrote a lot of jokes for this president when you were one of his speechwriters, including for the White House Correspondents Dinner. And I kind of feel like it's taken too long. I wanted to see him earlier out there making jokes and making fun of Trump and calling him by name, but he has really stayed out of the fray out of kind of respect for tradition in a way. But that's all, change in this last week. How effective is President Obama right now? And does it even matter?
I think I haven't talked to anyone about this, like inside Obama world. So this is just my guess, But I would think there's another reason he's stayed out of it, in addition to the fact that there's a pandemic going on. Nationally, we have such a short attention span these days. And so Obama entering the campaign trail for Biden was a news story in and of itself, certainly a local news story. And it's a big deal the first time he goes someplace. So I think getting those hits in right before Election Day, when we're really trying to motivate turnout, especially turnout among some of the black voters who showed up for Obama but maybe stayed home when Clinton was on the ballot in 2016. I think we're seeing Obama make that pitch at the right time. The timing is really important. It's so easy to get overexposed, even if you're a widely popular former president these days. But the other thing I should mention too is that there's no better argument for electing Joe Biden than giving all the attention to Donald Trump, right? Like the more super spreader rallies he does, the more ridiculous things he says, the more he gets out there and says something, and it's not about how he's going to fight the pandemic, the better Joe Biden is doing. So there's lots of reasons for, to be very strategic in how they're deploying their kind of like heavy hitters. Anyway, and I would say, broadly speaking, it's nice to have Obama there, not just because I like Barack Obama, obviously, but because he is kind of uniquely poised to call bullshit on all of this because he's done the job. So, most people could say that, but they haven't sat in the chair. They haven't been the president. They haven't faced those pressures. And for him to say, no, this guy is a bad president, that means something, not just because Obama is respected, but because he's done the work.
Yeah.
And he knows a lot about being president. He knows more about being president than, most people alive today, by kind of a lot.
I feel like every time he speaks, you're reminded of what a president looks like, acts like, and talks like. And I think that alone is important because we've forgotten to some extent, because as you said, things move pretty quick. In your new book, Democracy in One Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think, which I often reference and think is fantastic and everybody should buy, as well as in some recent articles that you've been writing. You're writing, of course, about the court. And it's very easy to become concerned and depressed about the future, given the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg died September 18th and Trump and Mitch McConnell went right ahead and were able to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to replace her. What do you think, if Biden does win, what can be done? Should he, as they say, pack the court, as I like to say, weaken the court by adding Merrick Garland, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton?
Well, I think let's start with this. What is happening with the court is both terrible for the court, and it's terrible for the Senate, and it's bad for America. And it's not even necessarily good for the Republican Party in the long run. It's just, it's this like crazy self-destruct mission. It would not have been hard to wait. Republicans already had a 5-4 majority on the court. They got incredibly greedy with Ruth Bader Ginsburg passing away just, a few weeks before the election. Her dying wish was to not be replaced until after the election, after the inauguration. And they just went ahead and did it. And by
Trump, by the way, denied that he believed. He said, I don't even believe that that's her dying wish. He actually, imagine saying that you don't believe somebody's dying wish. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah.
Because Trump is exactly the kind of person who would make up someone's dying wish. He would totally be like, no, her dying wish was keep America great.
He's the kind of person that would grab a dying person's hand and sign whatever they had left over to him. I'll take that last piece of cheese and couch.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the idea that somebody might actually be honest about this and that they might think about, things other than themselves once they're gone.
Yeah.
I don't think that computes for him. I think what you see when with what Trump has done to the court and what McConnell has done to the court, though, is they've just removed all pretense that this is an apolitical body. It wasn't just the fact that they rushed through Amy Coney Barrett. It was the fact that she was so evasive during her confirmation hearings to the point of kind of being disrespectful, right? We all knew what she had written. We all knew that she had opinions. She's a judge. It's her job, literally, to have opinions. And she wouldn't talk about anything. And then I think most gallingly, she starred in a Trump campaign ad That was her first thing she did as a justice of the Supreme Court. So regardless of how she rules, she could rule exactly like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, although I doubt she will. Even if she did, the process has now been so clearly corrupted that the Supreme Court's basically just a bunch of lawyers who work for the Republican Party and then 3 other justices trying to stop them when they can. And that's a pretty big problem. Now, the solutions are all there because there's tons of stuff President Biden and a Democratic Senate and House can do if they want to balance out the court. So I would say, I mean, first of all, when we're talking about court packing, the court has been packed, right? That's what we just described, was the packing of the court. Mitch McConnell did it. To his credit, he was very effective at doing it. Now the question is how we unpack the court. I absolutely think Joe Biden and Democrats, if they have the chance, should expand the court and balance out some of the seats that Republicans either took completely unfairly through when they held open Scalia's seat after he died and Merrick Garland didn't even get a hearing. I think the fact that Trump lost the popular vote matters a lot when you think about justices, right? I think just the whole point of having the president pick the judges is that the people have a mechanism to change who's on the court. Well, the people made it very clear who they want on the court, and we now have 3 Supreme Court justices who will do the opposite of what we all voted for collectively in 2016. So anyway, I would be for adding 6 seats to the court, 2 for each of Trump's justices. And more importantly, or as importantly, I would also be for adding seats to undo the effects on the lower courts, because the lower courts have been totally packed. And Amy Coney Barrett's, she's going to be terrible for America, but she's a qualified judge. Some of these judges on these lower courts are like wildly unqualified, in addition to being extremely conservative rather than actually being like judges.
Yeah. Did you see today Trump nominated Antonio Sabato Jr.?
The worst part is I don't know if you're kidding.
Right. Exactly.
The only reason I don't think you're kidding is that there's literally no appeals court vacancies left.
And the sad thing is I said to my other guest on this same episode that you're on, Dr. Christina Greer, who's a political scientist, I said the joke differently and she had the exact same reaction. I said Scott Baio. She's like, wait, did he?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, and it could have happened while we're talking. and that, the fact that we've reached that point again is like for many years, many, very wise people have sort of said, well, what should we do if the court becomes politicized? How do we keep the court from becoming politicized? That question is over. The court is politicized. Now we have to figure out what to do about it. Go ahead.
Well, the hard thing to me is, with your idea and adding 6 justices, like the kind of most frustrating and depressing thing is nobody knows better than you about how long it takes to create change, to get a policy passed, and how, trying to have some control over the media cycle and what's being discussed. Imagine now we have to fight over the Supreme Court. So, climate or, restoring voting rights, all these other healthcare opportunity, fighting COVID. I mean, how will there be space in the media where there's a lot of space now, I know, much less in Washington, to get to right all of the wrongs when they're going to be so focused just now probably on the courts right away? Well,
I'm going to ask you a question, and it's going to end up being relevant. I promise.
All right.
Do you know, are you like friends with musicians?
Sure.
Have you ever hung out with musicians? I don't hang out with musicians very often, but it's happened like twice, and I remember this very clearly.
Yeah.
In my experience, and it's limited.
I've hung out with John Mayer quite a bit.
Okay.
Not quite a bit. When I say quite a bit, I mean once. Go ahead.
Okay, that's like quite a bit more than most of us. In my experience, if you spend a lot of time with musicians, sometimes all they want to talk about is like the structure of songs, right? Like,
sure,
this is really interesting. You're like, a lot about what you do, but also I would just like to hear some music. Like that's why I like music, is because the songs sound nice, and I don't want to like watch you, discuss all the details. I think we need to learn that basic lesson, and Republicans have learned it a long time ago. They did it, by the way, with the Amy Coney Barrett hearing, although to me that was too much, which is they were just like, okay, we know what we want to do. Let's just do it. Why go through all the rigmarole? Let's just do the thing we said we want to do because we think it's important. Democrats have plenty of good ideas. We've passed tons of laws since 2018 when we took back the House. So we don't have to like relitigate all these things. We don't have to go through the media cycle and like do one thing at a time. Just do it all. See what sticks. And that's one thing Republicans have, to their credit, done very well, rather than the Democratic approach, which has tended to be, okay, we're going to have this to-do list and we're going to do everything in a very careful, slow, organized way, which gives the maximum amount of time for the media to seize on one thing that they don't like and make that the story. Let's do all the things as though we think it's really important to get them done, right? Like, that's the other thing. That's exactly what we've promised voters for years. We've said, we want to make a difference in your lives. The way to do that is to do as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So and when it comes to the court, I think this is also very important. One of the things we've learned from Mitch McConnell is that voters do not care about process. And that's been terrible when Mitch McConnell has altered the democratic process to make it less representative. But while we're trying to do the opposite, we should be willing to say, okay, yes, it might not be popular to expand the court, but let's go ahead and do it. And let's nominate some great judges who people like and who will issue rulings that will make people's lives better. And then people will be fine with that.
Right.
Like, the process stuff is not ultimately what, if people can put up with, all of the conflicts of interest in the Trump years, all the corruption, because they don't feel like it applies to their lives, we can go ahead and expand the court, and it's not going to cost us politically. And also, importantly, it's definitely the right thing to do.
I hope you're right, and I hope that's the way it works. I hope they take your advice. What do you think about the idea of, Joe Biden, if he were to win, appointing really well-qualified people to carry out the work that you're discussing, and during that time, Biden himself acts fucking batshit crazy all day, every day to distract from the good work being done? Do you think that's an effective strategy?
Well, strangely, it might be. I don't think we should do it, but it's interesting to see. I think it's a sign of sort of like how broken our political media is.
He could just keep kissing his son.
Yeah, I think that Trump's, I don't want to say superpower, something, but the fact that he was able to get a lot of unpopular stuff through, right? Like, the least popular Trump has been was when he was focused on policy, healthcare, and taxes. The rest of the time, he's kind of been like, look over here. While Republicans do stuff. And that has been relatively effective. It's been very effective when you consider how unpopular all of it would be if people knew about it. So I think there is something to be said for that, although I don't think that Biden should do it. But I hope that the reporters who have covered this president don't immediately go back into full both sides.
Great point.
Now the pandemic is Joe Biden's problem.
Yep.
Here's a prediction. I think if Biden wins, that I think you will see like a series of reporters start to talk about the pandemic like Joe Biden has a political problem with it before he even takes office. Or that's just this. I think a lot of reporters are just like dying to get back to that, and I hope that they have second thoughts about it, because I don't think that's terribly responsible. That's
a great point. I fear you may be right. Okay, last question. David Litt, you and your wife doing all kinds of different volunteer work in the final days and hours of the election. What do you think is most effective for folks listening if they want to help out?
Canvassing, right? Knocking on doors in swing states. And that's not for everybody. This is a serious thing. There's spikes all over the place. So if you're in a low risk group, if you feel comfortable, then if you go, you can find it on the Biden website or whatnot. But and I will say they really are taking this seriously. We were canvassing in Pennsylvania last weekend, and they did a temperature check. I was like, I didn't know any of that. I thought they just said that, but like, no, they did a temperature check. You have to sign in. You have to affirm that you have no symptoms. You have to socially distance, and most importantly, they've set up staging locations outside, so you don't have to gather indoors, even in a socially distanced way, to like get all your information and stuff like that. So I was very impressed with that. I felt totally safe, and I'm like very serious about COVID safety. And so if you're near a swing state, if you're in a swing state, election day, if you can take the day off and go knock some doors and get out the vote. And the last thing I will say about why that's so effective, the lists and the data we had were really good. Like when, in 2016, the lists were not as good. And you could say we were talking to a lot of Republicans who were like, what's going on here? In this case, it was a get out the vote list. And it was like Democrats who you could tell were thinking about voting, but weren't there yet. And so, it's almost like you get to go vote for Joe Biden extra times, which you don't. Want to be very clear about this. Do not vote more than once, but you can have that effect just by getting someone else to the polls.
Is there an organization that you would mention or plug or?
I would do that through the campaign. It's just joebiden.com, and then I think probably /volunteer, but you'll find it.
My angry next door neighbor has just put up her Trump sign. Just days left to go. Should I retaliate in any way, or should I look the other way?
What does the Trump sign say?
Just Trump 2020. Just aimed at my house because she knows what I do for a living and she hates me for no apparent reason.
I think I don't know. I feel like you can say like at some point being like, oh, I think it's nice that you have a sign about how many COVID deaths we've had under Trump, but you're off by several 100,000.
Yeah, I should just add a few zeros and COVID deaths. Or make my own sign. That's really good. I didn't think of it.
Don't steal her sign. We're above that. But get a copy of her sign and then just add the little zero.
That's a good idea. Thank you for talking to me. I always love talking to you. I hope folks will follow you on Twitter, of course, and most importantly, buy his book, Democracy in One Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It's Easier Than You Think, as well as your previous book, which is a bestseller, about your time working in the Obama administration, which is so good as well. Thank you so much, pal. It's great to see you and joining me for these final days. Good luck. Thank you for all the volunteer work you guys are doing, too.
Yeah, good to see you too. I will see you on the other side.
Yes, I hope so.
All right. Have a good one.
Okay, smart guy, huh? I get smart people and I ask them pretty good questions and we all learn from their answers. That's the podcast. It's really brilliant, isn't it? It's really about my access. It's about my relationships and able to get a wide array and variety of people to join me. And I appreciate you being one of them. So thank you very much, David Litt, at David Litt. On the Twitter, I also recommend his website because he's good about posting his articles, davidlittbooks.com. And now for my next guest. I love talking to her. We've started talking a lot more off the air. I call her up and ask her questions. We text each other nature pictures. Gotten to be really good friends with this woman through quarantine, kind of virtually. I have great admiration for her. And listen as she explains things. She's such an excellent communicator. And I always notice those things when doing a podcast, when doing audio. No ums and ands, really. She gets right to the point. She makes great points. She seems to have the data at her fingertips like a Dr. Aaron Carroll type because she is a scientist. She's a political scientist at Fordham University. She and I met at MSNBC. She's a contributor to that network and many others. She is an associate professor at Fordham University, like I said, a political scientist. She's the author of a book called Black Ethnics, co-host on FAQ NYC, as well as politics editor at The Greer, and so much more. She's doing a new pop-up podcast with our friend Dr. Jason Johnson. I cannot say enough good things about the brilliant Dr. Christina Greer, who I always have a wide-ranging conversation with, and today's was no exception. She's on Twitter at Dr_CM Greer, and she's right now on Stand Up. How do you feel about a man with a ring?
A ring?
A decorative rings.
I don't mind decorative rings. I mean, wedding rings are one thing. So.
No, I don't mean wedding rings. Although I think that I never wore one, except when we had to pretend we were married in Italy. All right.
I don't mind decorative rings. I actually don't mind earrings on a man. I don't mind jewelry on a guy.
I feel like it's dependent on the guy. I feel like if he's a rocker, then it's like, oh yeah, of course. But I feel like if he's like a suburban dad and he's wearing like a one hoop earring, I'm like, mm-mm.
Well, like nobody needs that Michael Jordan earring.
Oh, is that just a stud?
No, he has that big old hoop. He looks like a pirate.
Oh, really? Just one?
Yeah.
Why do I not? Was that something that was he wearing it in the whatchamacall, Doc?
I think so, probably. He wore it a lot and he still wears it. And I'm like, hey guy, 2020's calling. Like that hoop is.
Do you ever watch a show or a movie and something that they're doing in that show or the movie makes you want to do it? And I mean, like, it made me think of it because Michael Jordan, in that whole documentary, he was holding a cigar and a glass of whiskey, which made me want to do both and made me do both. Like, I started smoking, like, I bought a few cigars after watching that.
Oh, I'll send you the website. I buy my dad lots of cigars.
Oh, all right.
It's a great website that has like nice, they're Dominican, they're not Cuban cigars, but when I travel internationally, my dad's like, so here's what you need to do.
That's nice. I like to support my local cigar shop. It's called Dad's. That's literally the name. And it has one of those rooms in the back where you can smoke cigars. Uh-huh. And I've never been brave enough to go in that room because I don't think those are my people.
Oh, no. The thing is, with cigar smoking, I mean, my dad's a big cigar smoker.
Brings everybody together.
He's got a humidor.
Oh, wow.
Like he said, at his funeral, he's like, I want everyone to come back to my house, drink all of my expensive rum, and smoke all of my great cigars. Like, that is.
Oh, man. How do I get an invite? Well, that's a morbid thing to invite yourself to. Sorry. Go ahead. Well, that means he loves cigars. But what are you saying that that cigars bring people together?
Like the men that I know who smoke cigars aren't pretentious. I think some people want to be pretentious, but like in those rooms, I think a lot of them are like, it's like a nice opportunity for us to kind of get to know one another.
Why?
And you have a quick bond because you have this thing that you both like.
Why does smoking a cigar seem more exclusively male than anything else I can think of? Like, I can't even think of a woman smoking a cigar.
I've smoked cigars. I just don't like the taste. My cousin smokes cigars with my dad. I think it's like, this kind of phallic power symbol that men like.
So it's not
like all the powerful men who smoke cigars, right? Like Churchill,
Schwarzenegger,
like various presidents, who was it? Who's the president who went through, was it Teddy Roosevelt went through like 40 cigars a day?
No.
Yeah. Like just literally chewing them, right? When you think about like bosses, like bosses, like to be a boss is to have a cigar.
Mafia dons. Italian. It's a lot of Italian, I feel, ethically and like, I guess like
Cuban.
Yeah. But it
like even old school pictures of like older black people.
But if you're saying that, that it's kind of a phallic power thing, and you're also saying it's not pretentious, it's either one of the two, and I think why I don't want to be in the room, maybe.
But at least,
and then that begs the question why I would like a cigar.
Yeah, but I think nowadays the people who, have humidors in these places, in these cigar houses, and like actually go to the, the back room and smoke, or before, COVID did that. At least the ones I met, I went to a party and it was like a diverse party, and I was not expecting that. Like lots of age diverse, racial and ethnic diversity. And I was like, what is going on here? Because the couple that invited me, I did not think knew anyone.
That's fun. Well, that's a nice surprise.
Yeah. But there were all these like different types of people there. And I was like, this is interesting. And the wife was saying, oh, these are, my husband's friends from his cigar room.
Oh, that makes sense why there's a diverse group. Okay.
Yeah. And I was like, if not, I think it would have been, all white men of a certain age. And this was not the case. And like everyone did different things. And I was like, oh, this is fascinating. So I think you should swing by and check it out. I
feel like I don't know you that well. I'm getting to know you better, but I feel like you're a very like healthy person physically and emotionally. Like you're smart, you're self-aware. You know what maybe your triggers are. You take care of yourself emotionally, and then I feel like physically you seem to be pretty healthy in terms of like just what little we've talked about diet. We've never gone out to eat or anything. Like I'm terrible at, but big on judging and making assumptions. But I do feel like you're very cautious about coronavirus. So you're very much thinking about your emotional and physical well-being a lot. And I have a question about that as it relates to coronavirus. But what am I missing about you, Dr. Greer? Physically and emotionally, you seem very healthy.
My emotional health is of the utmost importance, right? Because I can't be of service to anyone if I'm not of service to myself, right? So that's a priority. I don't eat junk food just because we didn't really grow up with junk food, but I have some vices that, I recognize that the vices I have need to be counteracted with like a healthy way of living, because these are vices that aren't going away.
Right.
These are vices that we don't need to discuss on the podcast. We can discuss it for text.
That's fine. But I like, go ahead.
We grew up where it's like, do you want potato chips or like a bowl of fruit? And it's like fruit, I much prefer water to soda because soda makes me break out. And I stopped drinking soda when I started going out with my friends in middle school. You have like your little bit of money, you have your $20.
Yeah.
We used to always go to restaurants, even as kids. We just loved, going out. And I recognized that like buying a soda at a restaurant was $2 to $3. and I could pocket that money and use it towards something else. So that's when I just started drinking water when I went out. And then slowly but surely, it's like the taste of soda feels like a straight shot of, insulin. I don't know what insulin feels like, but it feels like a straight shot of sugar.
That's fascinating. It's all very healthy. I'm impressed. Going back to taking care of yourself so you can be of service to others, where does that lesson come from? Is that something you learn over life from a person in a book, or on the trail?
No, I think my parents are really, they were always sort of like, we are your parents. You are our number one priority. But like my parents took vacations without us. They hung out with their friends without us. Like we were clearly important, very, very important to them. But they always had time for like their lives, And so like when we went on vacation, it was just like, we're going to have a blast. But my mom was like, I'm going to sleep for a few days. Like I'm exhausted. And it's like, okay, that's, and like sleep is a real thing. And it's funny because I was just telling someone, I was like, I had a bedtime. Like I go to bed late now, but like all through high school, my bedtime was like 9:30 or 10 o'clock, self-imposed. Like, good night. I'm going to bed because I like a solid 8 hours. I could
talk for hours about sleep, its importance, and how much I value it. Go ahead.
Listen, I will tell you this. I have a whole regiment about sleep hygiene. Like sleep hygiene is a thing. And like most people have really bad sleep patterns and sleep habits. And like, I don't sleep well. And I'm like, listen, I have a whole thing to get you started. I've got the charcoal pads that you can put on your feet to like suck out the toxins. I've got a good eye mask. I've got a proper mouth guard for my dentist. I've got the lavender that I can, roll behind my ears to like help me sleep, or the lavender baby lotion that, you use with babies. I have brown noise that I put on. I like to wrap my hair up just because I think sometimes having something covering your head, like sort of makes you warmer and like sort of it's more of a cocoon feel. Like I'm serious about my pillows and sheets. I'm serious about what I like to sleep in for pajamas and like, cotton count and things like that. I'm like, I will sleep. And also no TV and phone in the bed. No internet right before you go to sleep.
Where does your phone go?
My phone is to the side of my bed. I have to, like, now that I live alone, I have to sleep with my phone sort of nearby in case my parents call. And
right. So
like, you've been kidnapped. I'm like, how is that the first go-to? I've been kidnapped?
That seems. They know you're a full-grown adult.
Right. I mean, I think my parents do worry about me just a little bit because there are so many crazy people in the world. And I talk about politics and I make sort of MAGA folks very angry. And I get lots of hate mail in various ways, gradations of hatred and threats. So I do think that they, they're concerned. So if they call, I do pick up. But I mean, my parents, my dad is the only one who sometimes just calls like random, like, so he'll call it like 11:30. This is pre-COVID. And I get so nervous. Like, why is he calling me at 11:30?
Yeah.
And he's like having cigars with a buddy or buddies drinking rum. And he's basically like, I paid for all this fancy education. If he has a question about anything, he calls.
He has you on call and he says it's transactional.
Well, he's like, basically, if I was on Millionaire, you'd be my lifeline. And I'm like, okay, Dad, but it's 11:30 and I'm worried because you're calling. And he's like, no, I'm sitting here with Uncle Pete. And he had a question. And the thing is, I'm so good at this. My dad will say, there's a guy. Who's the guy who was in the thing back when? And like, I've now gotten really good at like context clues. And I'm like, is it a movie or a play? Is it a real show? Like, is it a real person? Is it a character? Like, are they black or white?
Fun.
Are they old or young? And then pretty soon I'm like, oh, you mean so-and-so. He's like, yep, thanks. All right.
That's fun. You must be a lot of people's call for questions.
I'm very popular during election season,
yeah.
I will say. And lots of people feel like they've got a political scientist on call.
Well, I'm glad I do.
Personal political scientist that they can just...
Well, that, by the way, that's just sidebar. That's like kind of what the secret sauce of this podcast is that I know a bunch of really smart people that I call them. And then I would feel selfish with your time, obviously, much less my own, if I was the only one who got to hear your wisdom, your experience, or as you and I tend to do, your anecdotes, which I find super fascinating and awesome and healthy. Like when I hear you're talking about your life, your sleep, or other things, often when I'm talking to you, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do that. Like I think I've stolen a lot from you, but I like the idea of that I get to share it with a whole bunch of people. So thank you for joining me. And I want to ask you a bunch of questions. First of all, you and Our friend.
Yes, can my payment be that fleece that you're wearing?
Oh, I get so many compliments on this.
I want that fleece.
You can have it.
It's
probably one of my favorites because it matches my eyes. But if you really want it, you can have it.
Matches my eyes.
Did I say that out loud? Did I say that into the microphone? I said that into the microphone?
Like the Republican Party, you say the quiet part loud.
Matches my eyes. There's only one Republican. You and Jason Johnson are doing a podcast, which has got me very aroused. What is it about? What are you guys doing? Is it permanent? I feel like you're doing like a billion things, and I'm not sure. I feel like they're just around election. You're doing a lot of talks, and then I watched a YouTube video that you narrated that has 5 million views, by the way.
Oh, the Electoral College?
That Electoral College thing, which I'm going to just play. I think I'll play it in this podcast if I'm allowed to.
I'll tell you about both. So the podcast with our dear friend Jason Johnson, who is a rascal, and he called himself a rascal last night on the podcast.
That's funny.
Saying so. It's a pop-up podcast. So I'm the politics editor at the Grio. He's a contributor at the Grio. And we share a mutual best friend who's a professor at Howard. And so we've gotten to know each other really well over the years. And the Grio has an already standing podcast called Dear Culture. And so they asked us to do just basically 4 episodes leading up to and through the election. And Jason and I talk on the phone all the time, and shenanigans and laughs. And we both study politics and have for a very long time. So this is basically conversations with Chrissy and Jason just now on a podcast.
That's awesome.
On the telephone.
I cannot wait to listen to those conversations, because I have conversations with both of you. I've tried to have conversations with both of you together and would love to make that happen at some point whenever you want. But that's awesome to hear you guys together. But my question immediately was, and is right now, like, how often do you guys disagree, and how often do you disagree vehemently? Not that I would think it would ever get ugly or personal, but do you guys disagree much on anything regarding kind of culture and politics?
We don't necessarily disagree. The interesting thing is, in the Supreme Court, there's the vote and there's the opinion. And the opinion sort of walks you through why someone chose the vote that they did. I think with Jason and myself, oftentimes our vote is the same, but how we would write up the opinion is different. And I think it's because there's a gender angle. Both of us have lived around the United States, so we do have that common shared identity where we haven't just lived in cities. We haven't just lived with Black people. We've both been in super diverse communities. His family's military, my family's corporate. He teaches at an HBCU. I do not. And so sometimes, and he's more into the journalism world than I am. I'm sort of a little bit more of a kind of standard political scientist, if you will. And I think Jason would agree with me in saying that. So we come at things from different angles, and we oftentimes end up in the same place. But the journey is a little different.
Well, you know what I'd love to hear you two talk about is gender.
Well, it's funny because both of us have, somewhat irreverent sense of humor. I think the difference is I shield a lot of that when I'm on a podcast.
Right.
Because I have a different type of employer than Jason does. And I do think that gender matters in that sense as well. And so I'm not as like Chrissy Greer on the phone chatting with you and Jason is going to be slightly different than Chrissy Greer showing up as Dr. Greer on your podcast. Whereas I think Jason is a lot more consistent in the sense that Jason on the phone is Dr. Johnson on the podcast.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like I have that same freedom or luxury in a lot of ways.
Well, then we'll have to do it over drinks and cigars.
Right, drinks and cigars.
What do you think is at stake in the election? Because I feel like when people answer that question, they kind of reveal their priorities.
Yeah. I mean, I'm of this mind, and Jason and I talked about this yesterday on our podcast, Dear Culture. If Biden wins, the work still continues. We're going to have to undo minimum 4 years of really serious damage. I think the difference is we can give ourselves, say, 24 hours or 7 days of a reprieve and then get to work.
That's all we get?
that's all we get. And then, put your foot back on the gas. I think, if the president is reelected, it exposes a lot about what this country really is. I mean, it also exposes what we know about theft and cheating and voter suppression. But the work continues. I mean, Biden's not going to be some miracle solve. I also think that the Senate matters and what that looks like. The courts aren't the be all end all. It's really important. Don't get me wrong. But when RBG died, and everyone's like, oh my God, it's over. Like, so many smart people that we know, like, it's over. I mean, just like Nellies. And
yeah.
like, that's just not how the universe works. It's just not. One person, yes, they can do a lot of damage, as we've seen, but it just means we have to do a different type of work. I think about the things that my grandparents and great grandparents went through. It's nothing. What we're going through is literally nothing compared to what they went through. So it's just I'm not going to be apoplectic. I'm not going to run around like Chicken Little, like the sky is falling down. I think that there is some serious work that has to be done, no matter who's in office. I think that this president's administration are murderous criminals, and not enough people are recognizing that and calling that out. But if they're not reelected, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we go back to being a utopia. We don't. So I'm I don't believe in freaking out about things, that are beyond my control. I'm a little Black girl in New York City. There's but so much I can do. I feel like I'm doing the things that I can do. And I think that there are a lot of people who are freaking out about November 3rd. And I'm like, there's a lot that you could still be doing right now that you're not doing.
Right.
You're just worried about November 3rd and November 4th and everything that follows. It's well, then get to work. You still have 5 days.
I think
you
that's
could be calling people in Pennsylvania, Ohio, right? In North Carolina and Florida. You could be giving money to candidates for a last minute ad push. There are a lot of things that you can be doing. You can be talking to your racist ass, relatives that are still on the fence. And you're like, oh, well, they're just going to do what they're going to do. It's no, have serious conversations before election day. So I just feel like I'm not going to let this man, I've said this from day one, he is not going to take years off of my life. And I think that he has taken, he's definitely taken people's lives, period, with COVID. But I think the stress of it all is real. And I have felt stressed in the past 4 years for a host of reasons. I mean, the poverty that certain people are experiencing that we're not, but the dire circumstances of immigrant families, it's criminal. But at the same time, it's I am of use to no one if I'm just in a ball on the floor filled with anger and rage, because that's going to, give me all types of health effects and mental challenges. And I'm not going to be helpful. I'm not going to be helpful to the students I teach and the future generations of America. I'm not going to be helpful to my family who need their own personal political scientists. So I'm just trying to keep it all in perspective.
Well, that's all really good advice, not only for our political paradigm, but just for life in general, because I think when dealing with real emotional stress and anxiety, one of the best things that you can do is get to work and be busy and do stuff, which is what you mentioned about getting, trying to get out the vote, trying to do stuff, make things happen. And then the other part, just about what you said about, taking care of yourself. You can't, if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't do anything else for other people, which I think both really important pieces of advice, really, frankly, for any time. You said undo. It's going to take years to undo the damage. That's the kind of thing when someone says it, I make assumptions as to what they mean. But what kind of damage do you think is the most longstanding or severe that it will take time to undo? Because I like to think that Joe Biden can just put the right people in the right places in government, and they'll fix everything. Everything will be fixed. But I also realize, as a person, it takes a long time to build a reputation, and just a moment to destroy that reputation. And the reputation of anything from Department of Justice to FDA to NIH has been damaged, and that matters, because if people don't trust those agencies, we have problems. That's my amateur approach at the undo the damage thing. What are you talking about?
I think that's a brilliant place to start. I mean, so many of our federal agencies have been led by people who are wholly incompetent and wanted to destroy the agency. That was deliberate, right? So we're going to have to sort of possibly hire back some career professionals who were forced out so that they could make space for the cronies that have been in the Trump administration. Our Department of Justice needs to completely be kind of rebuilt. I mean, because Bill Barr has just destroyed it on so many levels. To say nothing if we have to figure out what we're going to do with these lower level courts where these people who barely have a law degree were put in with F ratings from the American Bar Association. You know, they've never really practiced law, and they're right-wing fundamentalists.
Did you see that Trump nominated Scott Baio today for a lower court judgeship?
Are you serious?
No, but the fact is that that your reaction to it's not unreasonable, and that's why I did it to you.
I have to ask. I mean, and so like even like the Postal Service, you know, the way that they've sort of defunded it and made it so disorganized. Horrible. And then to say nothing about our international partners. You know, our Secretary of State and possibly Kamala Harris, you know, as Joe Biden's dealing with domestic issues, he's going to have to employ several people, not just the Secretary of State and possibly the VP, several people to go rebuild relationships. There are countries, not just in Europe, but all over the world, who have been moving on without us. They don't need us. They've shown that we are a bunch of criminals. You know, we've been pointing the finger at the continent of Africa for decades, like, oh, look at them. They're so corrupt, and look at their leadership, and they're dictators. And Africa's like, look at how we handle the coronavirus. Don't you ever talk to us about elections again. You all are worse than us. And you're doing, you know, sort of our old school playbook times 12. So like, keep your finger pointing away from the continent of Africa. So we've got relationships that have been almost severed, you know, and I think some people will come to the table, but I think Donald Trump has exposed us. It's like, we're broke, right? We've got an ailing population, largely because the president doesn't believe in science. You know, we're ripe for the picking for some sort of terrorist event because they know that we're sort of in a weakened position. So I think that the international community, that is going to be a priority, just to sort of keep us safe, because Donald Trump has, you know, not bolstered relationships and intelligence, right? I mean, we're not even talking to the people who have their ears.
Well, our own intel people don't want to share intelligence with their boss, much less the British and the Israelis and anybody else.
Don't know like what he's going to do afterwards.
He'll go tell everybody like right away, but like, you'd never believe who I just talked to.
Well, I mean, or he'll sell it, right? I mean, that's not beneath him.
Worse, yes, right? Yes, I mean,
yes. We're dealing with the bottom of the barrel over here. And my friend Morgan Peckma, I don't know if you know Morgan, but
I started watching the film that you say it's very good, and I got interrupted, and you reminded me of it, and I'm like, oh, I got to finish that. Tell me about this.
So Morgan's the director of Get Me Roger Stone, but like this AC/DC film, I mean, it's only 20 minutes, but I mean, showing how Trump is like basically a smash and grab of Atlantic City. You know, like he does not care about people, and he actually sees his supporters as rubes and marks and just, you know, idiots. I mean, that's why he has them standing out in Omaha freezing to death, literally. So I think that Joe Biden, you know, if elected, will have to really pull in a lot of folks who understand the issues. I mean, if you think about, by and large, like the cabinet, it's the least competent cabinet we've ever seen. These are people who are just spouses of individuals or folks who gave a lot of money, who have zero understanding of the agency they're in charge of, or they're specifically put there to destroy said agency. Betsy DeVos, Dr. Ben Carson, Pompeo, and his international knowledge is little or none. And we've seen that, you know, he's just kind of steamrolling people. Chow, who's the wife of Mitch McConnell, where it's like, she's been working with China way before she was ever in the cabinet, making money for him and for herself. So, I mean, like the list goes on and on of like the sheer incompetence and corruption, which is really frightening. And I don't know what November 3rd brings. I mean, you know, people are saying the map looks good. I have not been out and about, like I haven't traveled, you know, so I don't get a feel. And, you know, Twitter is not, you know, that's an echo chamber for a lot of us. So it's not the real world in a lot of ways. So I can't call it. I feel good in the sense that the early turnout numbers look good, but I mean, the theft is going to be real. Like the antics and the shenanigans they're going to pull.
Yeah. I feel like so far there haven't been major irregularities based on what we thought would happen. And I feel like that's a testament to a number of organizations and individuals and a lot of money being poured into those to fix things, to watch things, to make things work better in different states and so on. The primaries were a bit of a test run, figured out a lot of things out there. I feel like it's been very peaceful
by and large.
So far.
Recognize it's like you got Republicans in California putting out fake ballot boxes. You got your boy in Boston burning ballot boxes, right? We've got voter intimidation in Virginia, and they accidentally cut power lines for early voting, right? We've got the Supreme Court case in Pennsylvania where they're like, okay, so we're just going to put these ballots aside until after the election, and maybe we'll use them, maybe we won't, depending on, basically how it shakes out for us. So like, there are little things that we need to be paying attention to, and like Biden needs to win.
It's a good list you just ripped off there. Yeah.
Because Florida is always a percentage point here and there.
So he has to win by such a large margin, which I think is a really important point that we can't make enough, because that's one scenario. And the other scenario, if it's not a large margin, then you have 500 different ways that it can go and things that can develop.
But mayhem, right? And you've got Steve Bannon already saying, well, we're going to declare victory. And so then the media has to sort of follow our pace. And we've seen the media just be wholly inept in dealing with this type of...
That man's name makes me start like just flinching, and I don't want to say his name. It's like Voldemort. And I got so mad at somebody, who was it, like Tim O'Brien, who I love, Tim O'Brien from Bloomberg, wrote all about Trump. I feel like you might know him from MSNBC, but he like shares these Steve Bannon videos with criticism, quoting around. I'm like, don't share them. Don't share them. Don't put that out there. It's not good. I voted yesterday. I waited in line like over an hour and a half in the rain. And because I'm a stand-up comedian, and because specifically I'm the type of comedian who looks at the audience and gets a lot of my material out of the moment. That's what I did, warming up for the audiences at Colbert and The Daily Show. I didn't do material. I just see people in the audience. And what that meant was, Chrissy, was that I would judge them. I would decide all kinds of things about them. That's an older European man. And then I would make these jokes, and it would be all fun and games. It's not a good quality. It's a terrible quality, but it's one that I've refined. I employ it while voting. I think, though, but most people do. My point is, I looked at that line. I decided who everybody was voting for. And the assumption that I make about, because I want to ask you about this one, black voters, is that one of two things. Always impressed and sometimes even surprised that they care, because the cynicism is so understandable and real that maybe it doesn't matter if I get involved. But then when they are there, assuming they'll stay there all day long to make sure that their vote counts because of the fight that they understand in the history and so on. And then I assume that they're voting for the more progressive candidate in general. Do any of those assumptions serve anybody? A, and am I just a scoundrel? So that's a personal question. And B, what about the assumptions in this case about black voters?
So I think black voters are, I would argue, the truest patriots, because this country has been such a disappointment time and time again, yet we still show up to try and move this democracy forward. It is an incorrect assumption to assume that black voters vote for the most progressive candidate. Black voters are by and large more moderate, because we understand white people. That's the thing. We understand our interests, and we understand the limits of whiteness. And so oftentimes we'll vote for our second or even third choice, because we recognize that maybe our first choice will be so far into white people that it won't work. I mean, this is what explains Joe Biden, right? Black people understand white folks after Hillary Clinton, they were not going to vote for a woman at all. They weren't going to vote for Castro or Corey or Kamala as the top of the ticket. They knew that. We've seen the backlash of Obama. And so or Bernie, like black folks by and large aren't hyper progressive, because we understand this country and we understand the limitations of white people and what they are willing to give or give up. So that's why Joe Biden emerged victorious and quickly, right? Because it's like, listen, white folks in this country, if we're supposed to get any of them to move over, they're not going to go for the progressive candidate. They're not going to go for the female candidate. They've shown us time and time again. White women show us every 4 years that they vote for the Republican candidate. We can't bank on them. So Biden wasn't necessarily ideal for everyone, but it's like he's the consensus candidate. He's the candidate that can kind of get enough white folks to come on board and hopefully have a chance at this. There's no way if Cory Booker were at the top of the ticket, or Kamala Harris or Castro or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie, we'd be in this position. Because the thing is, the vast majority of Democrats aren't progressive, let alone black people, but Democrats aren't progressive. We have pockets, but that's it. Most Democrats are middle of the road, moderate conservatives, just like the middle of the distribution curve. Clinton was a moderate Democrat. Obama was a moderate Democrat. Skin color is radical. Politics, moderate, right? And so I think that
this is political science you're throwing down right now.
What'd you say?
This is political science that you're throwing down right now. By the way,
this is what I do for a living.
I know, but it's like I think some.
Based on my feelings.
I know, but it's funny you say that because I can imagine some listeners saying I don't agree, and I'm thinking what you're saying isn't based on your opinion or your feelings. You're looking at the data and the science, and in terms of what the framing of those words mean, moderate, progressive, and so on. I mean, I suppose we can agree or disagree on that, but I think, you know, there's got to be some template for it, and I think that you're applying that without noting each and every issue, healthcare, economics, etc. So go ahead. Sorry. I don't know where I interrupted you, but.
So, I mean, by and large, that's where we are. And I think that this is like the best combo.
So black people basically are voting on the limitations of white people.
Yeah, we know what we like, but we also know the extent to which white people will cut off their own noses to spite their own faces. We know the depths of white racism, and we know the limits that white people will go. And we've seen the backlash post-Obama. So it's like, we can't make that mistake again because as black women, especially, have tried to tell everyone, black women were the ones running through the streets, ringing the alarm. Like, Donald Trump is dangerous. He will tank this company or this country the way he's tanked every single company. We know that basically when things are bad for white people, they're abysmal for black people. So we try and warn white people like, hey, this guy is no good. It's like, well, a lot of people will take a little racism over anything else, right? And so this has been our cross to bear in this country that we care about, but we have to negotiate. I mean, we don't have the luxury to just think about our issues or our opinions or our feelings. We have to always have the calculus of what white people are going to do. And so this is why you see older black people are the smartest and most astute political scientists ever, because they've been around white people for a very long time and they know how white people behave. And so they can always sniff out the candidate that will be the best for them, right? In sort of, you know, when you do probability, right? So you try and find, it's kind of like a game theory exercise. You try and find the candidate that you can live with that also white people will actually vote for. This explains Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders every single day. Also, the fact that Bernie Sanders refuses to really substantively talk about race or ever come and talk to black people.
So when you talk about older black people and what they know, I mean, I can't add anything to that. I wouldn't argue with that. I think the only thing I would add is like, you know, that's James Clyburn is one of the most influential black Republicans, Democrats, and he delivered South Carolina to Joe Biden. I think it's fair to say his endorsement.
Bernie didn't even bother to go down and ask. He just made the assumption that Clyburn was going to go with Biden. But also, though, keep in mind, and this is an important point, black people notice that.
Right. His endorsement.
Even humble himself to go and ask James Clyburn for his endorsement, knowing that he wasn't going to get it. But it's the symbolic act of doing it. He wouldn't even do it. And then after that, he skips Selma and goes to Minnesota or someplace, because it's like, well, forget it. I'm not going to get black people. So what's the point? So it's like, you're a fair weather friend of black people and it's not appreciated and it's noticed.
Well, the point, though, is that James Clyburn, who's a much older black man, endorsement matters. Not that many people's endorsements matter that much anymore, but his does. But my question to you is, that you talked about what older black folks know and think and why they're trusted. I saw that, I can't find it right now, but there's this recent polling about how much younger black people specifically care about climate, environmental issues. And I was kind of surprised by it. But do you think that that's in terms of the disagreement or different wavelengths that younger black voters and older black voters might be on? Do you think that that's an accurate? Are you surprised to hear that that would be an issue that younger black voters care about? Or what other disconnect might there be between younger and older black voters, who I would imagine younger ones are a lot more progressive?
Right. Younger people are by and large more progressive. But I mean, the caring about the environment doesn't surprise me at all, because keep in mind, younger voters in general care more about the climate than older people. But like, environmental racism is real, right? We've seen Flint and Newark and, you know, communities all across the country that don't even have safe drinking water. We've seen neighborhoods that are hotter than other neighborhoods. In Baltimore, Stockton, California, all across the United States, cities that have Black neighborhoods that are literally 2 and 3 degrees hotter than their white counterparts because they don't have trees, right? I mean, we know about noise pollution. We know about light pollution. I mean, all of these things actually are of great concern to younger people because they realize it's like, well, what kind of planet are you leaving me? I think also, though, younger people don't fully understand. I mean, they're growing up in a different type of racial climate, So like older Black people are like, we know Joe Biden. Like we know the 78, 77-year-old white man. Like we know his limitations. He's not evil. He tries. He missteps every now and again. But, at the end of the day, we can work with him. I think a lot of younger Black voters they want a more ideal candidate. And it's like, you'll see. Like, I don't know if that person exists. So like
right.
Working within the institutional structures to kind of get what you want. But the climate stuff does not surprise me at all because it's linked to public transportation and how people can and cannot get to work, right? It's linked to all of these issues that really are of great concern to young Black people, as far as industries and like what types of jobs they can get. It's like, when the president's talking about we're bringing coal back, I was like, great, it's 1896. But that's also a white nationalist way of saying it's like, I want this particular white demographic that didn't keep up with the rest of the world and is still in some antiquated nonsense, right, to move forward with this polluting profession, right? And so like all of these things add up to a larger economic and racial understanding of different candidates.
What about if it were a free and fair election, why do you think that we do not have a very democratic representative system? You have this really great video I mentioned earlier explaining the Electoral College, but even if it were a free and fair election, it's still a very broken system, right?
Yeah. I mean, everyone's like, the Electoral College is racist. I'm like, every single policy in this country is built on racism. Every single one. So like, I'm not going to single out the Electoral College.
And so let me just, interrupt to say, if every policy is based on racism, then isn't the most important policy for people who are concerned about that, and especially for Black voters, voting? Isn't that before anything else, voting?
Well, I mean, I would argue, yeah, but I mean, you see the importance of voting and how elected officials have gone out of their way to make it difficult for Black people to vote from the 15th Amendment on, right? And then the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that sort of went into effect in 68. So like Black folks have actually not even been voting free and fairly for very long, but we can see neighborhood by neighborhood, the racial gerrymandering, right? Also the partisan gerrymandering. We can see how Black neighborhoods aren't funded in the same ways with the electoral booths. We can see that those are the ones that always happen to have the lines and machines that are broken and the cords that aren't delivered and the ballots that are, undercounted or underdelivered as well. So, I mean, there's a way that Black people have been specifically and deliberately kept out of the voting process because that is one of the most sacred rights you have as a citizen of the United States. This is why people, I vote every election. I don't care if it's a runoff. I don't care if it's a municipal election. I don't care if it's a special election, because people will, literally think about it this way. People were literally lynched to try and vote, right? Or murdered or raped. Because, we always brush over the fact that rape was used as a powerful tool to suppress progressive behaviors, right?
I don't know what you're talking. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about.
The same way, developing nations with dictators use rape as a powerful tool, right, to subjugate their populace. The United States did the same thing.
Terrorists do often as well.
It's domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is why Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a rape investigator.
She was?
We know her as like the sweet, cute Rosa Parks who like sat in the back of the bus. Before that, she's a badass that traveled around the South by herself, investigating rapes of women by white community members.
I didn't know that.
That was her job.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's why she was chosen, because she's actually very well respected within the NAACP for her work that she'd done investigating rapes. Because there was a woman whose name I'm blanking on, but she was raped by like 5 men on the side of the road, and she did not die. And Rosa Parks went and investigated it, and like basically to try and bring charges against these 5 white men who lived in her community, right? So she still has to see them on a daily basis.
She was a hero for her work long before she took a stance on a bus. Huh?
Yes.
Wow.
So, I mean, like, or we can think about Fannie Lou Hamer, who was, forcibly sterilized along with several other Black women, right? Hundreds of other Black women. So history repeating itself today with what's going on in Georgia and the detention centers and, the camps. So this country has a really long, brutal, horrible history, especially when it comes to, Native populations, people of color, the Chinese, like certain white ethnic groups at different points in time before they get to become white. So I think part of the issue is that we've just never been honest with ourselves about who this country is and how we've always tried to exclude certain people, and slowly but surely people get included in. But like the vote is one of the most precious tools. And we know it's precious because we can look around the country with people who are waiting in line for 8 hours to say like, oh, wow, folks don't want you to have this thing, right? Like, and if they have to begrudgingly give it to you, they're going to make it really difficult for you to take advantage of it.
White people discovered terrorism September 11th, 2001. Black people, foreign terrorism. Thank you.
They still don't think that, by and large, white people don't think that domestic terrorism exists. They're still looking for brown people to like blow things up. And it's like all of our agencies have said, it's like, okay, the threat of foreign terrorism is minuscule compared to the threat of domestic terrorism of white people in this country.
Brown people are like, we're busy working. We don't have any time to...
we're busy trying not to get killed by random white people.
Well, I want to ask you about that. Just the question I'm asking. White people, kind of discovered terrorism on September 11th, foreign, terrorist attack, everybody saw. And we were afraid for like the first time. And black folks laughed at us.
Afraid of Timothy McVeigh, right? Who did?
No, because that was like, that was a random act of violence. It wasn't something that, I don't think so. I think we were worried, some of us, about that kind of thing, but we weren't as concerned maybe, which makes no sense. But there's such a different perspective. And I think this is sometimes the hardest thing for white folks to understand about how black folks in America understand terrorism and see often police officers and certain types of white people, or even don't want to go to certain types of communities, or even the saddest one to me, don't want to go into the woods, don't want to spend time in nature.
Are you kidding? Like, I've seen every horror movie. Like, listen, I love nature. I'm a birder, right?
I know you were tweeted about, you even tweeted about that you're taking a birding class, and you and I ever exchanged a lot of pictures, nature related stuff. So
But like, think about Christian Cooper. He's in Central Park with his binoculars, right? There's a whole conversation about black birders where it's like, I don't want to get shot. It's someone's like, he has a gun. It's binoculars, right? Or a white woman just not wanting to put a leash on her dog and saying, he's attacking me, and calling the police, knowing what that means as a white woman, crying, calling the police with her dog yelping that she's causing, right? So like, that's a form of terrorism, period, end, right? I mean, the fact that I live in Brooklyn, there's half of Brooklyn I won't go to at all during the day or the evening. Half of Queens I won't go to. 3/4 of Staten Island I won't go to. I feel very uncomfortable in certain parts of Manhattan in the Upper East Side and very unwelcome, right? So it's like, and this is New York City, to say nothing of, when I've driven cross country. By and large, driving cross country, it was a very different time back then. It was before the Trump era. I wouldn't do it now. I would love to drive cross country. I am not going to do that. I'm afraid to drive across country, right? And so there's so many things.
What are you afraid of?
Miscellaneous white people and like going into the wrong area. Like,
I'm sorry I laughed at your fear, but the word miscellaneous got me.
Just because it's like, it's not all white people, but there's certain white people who don't see people of color as human, and they don't care, right? They know that by and large, they probably won't get in trouble. And if they do, it's worth it, right? And we see this time and time with vigilantes or cops, right? I mean, I was raised to not go to cops. If I am in trouble, find a miscellaneous black person. A random black person on the street is safer for you than a police officer. So
I feel like
I'm in a new community, I'm always just looking for black people. When I was in Italy, traveling with a buddy of mine who's white, and I'd see black people, this is when we were, in our 20s, I would just go over to them. I'm like, oh, hi, I'm Chrissy Greer. And they go, hi, babe. We're staying at this hotel. If you need anything, you let us know. This is before, smartphones and everything else. We're still using paper maps and things like that.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, so we're staying here. How long are you in town? I'm like, oh, I'm in Venice this number of days, and then I'm going to Milan, and then we're doing this. They're like, okay, well, we're going to be in the country for this long. We're staying here. Here's our itinerary. Boom. And my white friend was like, wait, who's that? I'm like, random black person in Italy, where if I need anything, I will go to their...
The RBP. The RBPs.
What's the RBP?
Random black persons.
random black persons.
There's an RBP. You connect. Yeah, there's a safety. It's tribal, right? I think probably it's similar just being a woman too in some instances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think knowing what this country is, knowing the capacity of this nation is such that it's like, a lot of people underestimate just how recently bloody our history is, right? I mean, my parents grew up in the 50s and 60s. I mean, one day I'll play the recordings I did with my dad when I was with him in Delaware this summer. They're fascinating.
Oh, you taped your conversations. Did you tell me that? I think you might have told me that.
Yeah. And him just like talking about growing up in segregated Miami.
Oh, yeah.
Just, that's just what it was.
Oh, you got to share that.
He's in Miami, and I need to actually, I've tried to get my mom to talk about some of her stories because she was in like the deep, deep South. She's never gone to school with a white person ever a day in her life. And like, she doesn't really talk about her stories because they're a little more traumatic than my dad's stories.
Oh, I have a billion more questions for you, but I know I got to let you go. Christina Greer, Dr. Christina Greer, thank you so much for joining me for another fascinating, fun, thoughtful discussion.
I love being here. I absolutely love it.
All of the links to Dr. Greer are in the show notes, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
All right, Dr. Christina Greer at Dr_CM Greer on Twitter. And that is the end of today's show. I hope to see you tonight at the Zoom, if you're still listening, the Hangout tonight, 8 p.m. East. It's a costume party. Going to try to get to some surprise guests to join us. We'll play Who's the Guest? It'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that. That's tonight if you are a subscriber. And if you're not, become one now and join us. We welcome you to our community. Just go to standupwithpetedominic.com. Go to the paid subscription link on the show notes or patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And you can join us there. Be involved in the Discord chat where you're never alone. Because you aren't. There's always someone in there hanging out and keep you company. So check it out. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you hopefully tonight. If not, then Monday.